I'm just reading David Brown's book, The Divine Trinity, and I'm reading his chapter on the coherence of the Trinity. And he's been talking about um, unitary models that try to make sense of the Trinity and plurality models of trying to make sense of the Trinity. And he's basically making a distinction between Latin and social Trinitarianism. And as part of this chapter, he discusses some of Augustine's strategies as someone who's in the kind of Unitarian model. Perhaps Unitarian isn't the best word. What does he say? Either way, he emphasises the oneness, and the Cappadocians in a kind of plurality model. So he's working with that kind of classical distinction that you see quite often in the period that Brown is writing. Nevertheless, he notes some similarities which are really rather interesting, kind of almost a foreshadowing of some of the stuff that Ayres, Barnes, and who else? Ayres, Barnes, Coakley, people like that have noted. He says, in fact, in terms of their use of inseparable operation and making sense of the unity of the three persons, he says, in fact, all that can reasonably be said on the matter is that there is perhaps a difference of degree in the extent to which the difference between the persons is minimized, but certainly no difference in kind. In other words, what Brown is saying is that the Cappadocians and Augustine and the Latin Trinitarians are using the same strategy, but to a different degree. Augustine is perhaps minimizing the distinction between the persons more than the Cappadocians, but at the same time they're using a very similar strategy. One other thing that I was interested to see is that rather than denying Gregory's initial argument, because there's two arguments in his Ad Ablabium that try to make sense of the unity of the Trinity, rather than just kind of disagreeing with the argument on the basis that it doesn't provide a suitable unity, i.e. He basically says Gregory points out the difference between a universal and a particular, so humanity and men, and he says basically in actual fact there's just one humanity, yada yada yada, and he says there's just one divine nature and three particulars. What Brown does, instead of saying that still doesn't provide us with a robust account of ontological unity, what he actually says is that the Platonic realism, or the realist approach to abstract objects that Gregory takes, is outmoded. And this is kind of a trend I've seen a lot in some of the academic writers of the period. This is outmoded, therefore it's no longer valid. Or most people think most contemporary philosophers think this is incoherent, so the argument isn't powerful. But he doesn't provide any decent argument for rejecting realism as an approach to abstract objects. And even then, I think there's a certain amount of ignorance in perhaps the alternatives, because people like William Lane Craig aren't realists, they're anti-realists, but they still affirm that our use of abstract talk has ontological significance, if I remember correctly. So there are a few things there in Brown's book that I found quite interesting, and he seems to be doing a really good job of trying to make sense of these ideas, especially as he's writing early on in this period that I'm talking about. He seems to be seeking clarity in a way that other writers of the period that you find in some systematic theologians don't have. So really, really good kind of chapter. Even though I disagree with a lot of it, it's still, arguing clearly, I think. So there we go. I'll carry on.